Liman, do you have everyone that you were hoping to be here for the audit policy discussion? Or are we still waiting?
Yeah, I saw David is here. Yeah, we can start.
Okay. Well, before we do that, let me ask, does anyone else have anything they want to add to the agenda that's not on the agenda today? Or are we... Okay, well, if you do, please just add them to the agenda as we go through. And then, yeah, I'll hand it over to Liman and David. Go for it.
So, Doug, can you present or you want me?
Yeah, I can present.
Okay.
Let me know how you want me to move around or...
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Doug. Yeah, so David and I will present the audit policy. David is an intern. He started working on this project for his intern project. Yeah, so the proposal is to have an audit policy that allow user to control when a log is created and the content of the log. So the motivation is pretty clear. If customer has to log, so customer wants some control on what they are going to log, and to avoid log everything, which is on one hand it costs a lot of storage cost, and on the other hand it's very hard to identify any useful information from the large amount of logs. So we propose to extend the authorization policy to add a log action. So today, authorization policy has allow, deny, and the proposal is to add one additional action, which is called log. So basically, we want to use the matching condition, matching rules in authorization policy to control under what condition a log should be generated. And we should also introduce a log entry to control the log content. For the second part, it's actually pretty similar to the previous mixer policy. Doug, can you move up?
Where to?
Yeah, here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is good. So because audit policy is basically authorization policy with the log action, so it shares all the properties that authorization policy has. So for example, it can be defined at namespace scope and mesh scope. And the policies are additive, which means a request is logged as long as any log policy says so. And the policy should take effect only in the targeted policy scope. So if there is no audit policy applied to a given workload, the default behavior is basically log everything. There is no effect on the workload. So here are some examples for the log policy. So the first example says, log all the write requests to my API application on the /user/profile path. The second example says, audit all requests to my API except the request coming from a certain service count. And in this case, the service count is probably a robot service count and creating a lot of noise, which we want to filter it out. And another example is you probably want to audit only the internal user access. In this case, you can look at the domain claim in the JOS token saying that only the requests coming from acme.com should be logged. And that's also a very common use case. And you can also write a policy to log everything or log nothing. This is actually the same as how authorization policy works today. So in order to log everything, you basically create a policy that apply to the given namespace. In this case, it's NS1. And you can define a rule that has no restriction. So basically, you are saying everything will match this rule. So it's basically log everything. And log nothing is basically you create a policy, apply to the dev namespace, and but there's no rule allowing to log anything. So that's the log nothing policy. And if you apply this, if you set the namespace to the root namespace, you basically apply the policy to the mesh scope. Yeah, log entry, as I said, is actually very similar to the previous mixer v1 log entry. We also had a log entry to define the content of the log. So we can have source section, destination section, request section, and other context. And all the syntax is mostly copied from the previous mixer policy log entry. And yeah, now I'm going to hand over to David. David is going to talk about how this log policy is going to be implemented.
Can we? So do you want to have the questions about the actual doc later, or is this not the forum that you want to discuss it in?
You can ask questions, Amanda.
I mean, I'm okay waiting until he finishes the thing. I just wanted to check.
Oh, okay. Yeah. In that case, let David finish, and then we can have all the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. So to go into the implementation details, the way we were probably going to do it is currently the authorization policy uses the RBAC engine or the RBAC filter on Envoy. So, and right now we deploy two different filters. We deploy an allow RBAC filter and a deny RBAC filter. So pretty much on Istio, all we do is deploy a third filter, an RBAC filter that corresponds to the log action. The reason that we're deploying 3 filters and not 1 or 2 is because currently the RBAC doesn't really support multiple actions. And on Istio, we convert each authorization policy config into a single RBAC config. So it just wouldn't. There's no easy way to do multiple actions in one RBAC filter. So that's why we deploy the log action as a third filter. And this is the simplest change. Obviously, again, 1 action per config is reasonable. The issue is we need 3 filters to run on Envoy, but there is potential in the future. Envoy is looking into supporting multiple actions per RBAC filter, but for now, this makes sense. And the way we're actually transmitting this decision to Istio telemetry backends is we're setting a key. We're setting an access log policy key that can be read by each individual backend based on the matching principal permission and principal information. And then the telemetry backend can then determine whether it wants to log or not. So currently, in this doc, it says it's a filter state key. We've changed this to be a dynamic metadata key, simply because that seems to be more convenient for use in WASM extensions. And some of the other solutions that we considered for this, we're deploying all actions in one filter and doing allow log or deny log. But again, that would require a much bigger API change to both RBAC and Istio. And with allow log and deny log, it's not clear which of the filters we pair the log action with. So that's about it in terms of the implementation. It's pretty simple, especially on the Istio side. The only thing we're doing on Istio is adding another filter. On Envoy side, it's a little bit more complicated because we're adding a whole new action, but Envoy is generally supportive of this. They are already considering potentially adding multiple actions, just besides the regular allow and log or allow and deny actions. So yeah. Yeah, any questions?
Thanks, David. Yeah, so now we can take questions.
So I like the idea of passing in sort of an should audit flag or audit this mesh flag. I'm wondering, I think I see comments in here from John, and there's similar to mine. Can we, do we need to define log entry as part of this, or is this something that a telemetry API, a general purpose telemetry API could define, and you guys, the inside of authorization policy would reference somehow? Or I'm worried about fragmentation of places where we define telemetry scopes, and I don't know how other people feel, but I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah,
you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking of the alternative introducing independent audit policy instead of having it in the authorization policy. But because we are actually sharing all the rules, so one thing is it's introduce another CRD, and which is mostly almost everything is the same except the action. And actually when we designed the authorization policy, we were considering the different action, and the log action is one of the things we had in mind. And I actually sent emails to a couple of folks, including Louis and others, asking should we make it a more general name, because authorization. So we are also going to add audit, and the comments, the feedback was that because the main use case is for authorization, it's okay to keep it that name. And and I also mentioned in the comment replying to John, it's actually very common practice that log and allow deny are in the same policy. One example is like Calico network policy. It has the action field, which has allow, deny, log.
Open up Epic. It's mine. I did the level 6.
Allow, deny.
This is level 0.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No worries, we've all been there.
So Calico has the action field called allow, deny, log, and pass. So pass means it does not do anything. Similarly, in Google, we also have the RPC security policy. It has a very similar structure to this. It also has allow, deny. I'm not sure it has deny. Yeah, but log is part of it.
IP tables also has the same thing, right? You can allow, deny, or log. Yep.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not quite clear. I wasn't quite clear. I think having something that says log, that makes a lot of sense to me. I was wondering about the log entry CRD part of this.
Oh, okay.
Should that be something that we need, or should this be something from as part of a more general purpose telemetry API, which can be referenced somehow through this API, or is this, or do we want this to be a separate thing? And I'm sort of asking the group and you at the same time. So,
if you are planning some telemetry API that covers log entry, of course, this belongs to part of the telemetry log, telemetry configuration. Yeah, actually, even in the API version, I just used the config.istio.io, which is the previous API version for Mixer. So because I'm not sure where this API should belongs to, I don't think it belongs to a security API. So I think this group.
So I think right. So I think when to log and what to log are somewhat separate concerns, right? So we already have this, well, not this exactly, but we have something similar. We have a stateful filter, which decides when to log. And then the stack driver filter decides what to log it. It doesn't the first filter doesn't decide what exactly to log. It just says, yes, you need to log this log entry. And the actual filter that does the logging decides how it's configured and what the configuration is and all that. You're clearly combining those two things, at least at an API level, and saying that you will decide both when to log and what to log. It like to play nicely with all the ways that we can generate a log. It's probably best to leave it to the backends, right? So, for example, you can use stack driver logging to log, like we have today. You can also use just Envoy native logging.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah. So in that case, maybe I leave out the scope for what to log from this talk. Yeah, and yeah. So I think I'll leave it to to telemetry team to decide where to put the API and how do you support it.
So Lemon, another question related to what Mandar was saying. So currently there are a few other things which are logging, right? So we turn on Envoy access log. Is this going to replace that? Or is this going to work with it, or they are totally orthogonal?
I think today you're allowed to control which backend to plug in or what. Is that the control you're talking about? Turn on Envoy access log. So
yeah. there is a global option where you can say, I want Envoy access log sent. It will just be using the std out, and you can configure the format of that log and also the fields in that log. Additionally, you can use the Envoy filter to configure it at a per listener basis. I'm trying to understand if this works with it, or these are two orthogonal things.
I see. So if Envoy filter is deciding the condition when to log, then this filter is going to replace it. So I think we are providing a more native integration to allow user to control when to log.
The issue is, in my opinion at least, logging is very broad. So access logging is used for lots of purposes, whereas audit logging in true security sense is more for logging when you are doing something, whenever you're taking security related activity, right? So I'm a little confused as combining them, and how should I express this? So there's access log, which Envoy will do already. I'm thinking we are not stopping it, or that's orthogonal to this. But then there is an auth-z logging, which is provided in this document.
Yeah.
But
yeah, definitely.
So I think that there. Go ahead, Doug.
So I'm just gonna, I mean, it sounds like, and this is like something we discussed before about having separate streams for access versus audit. So I don't know what you're gonna say, Mandar, but
yeah. So actually, like the mechanism of creating the logs is again separate than the mechanism to decide when a log should be created. And we already have two broad mechanisms to create logs. One is Envoy's native access log, and we also have stack driver logs and then other logs as well. And those individual mechanisms have more configurability, right? With Envoy native access log, you can send it to the gRPC service, or you can log it to standard out, or you can do many other things. So the question is, is there a specific value in unifying when to log, right? And I think there is value in deciding when to log. But then the second question is there a value in also unifying what to log, or is that something that we leave to the actual backends?
Yeah, so actually this comes back to Niraj's point that there's a difference between the security wise audit log and the normal access log that's probably only used for debugging or other purpose, right? Yes. So from that sense, if we want to distinguish these two, so previously I was also had a like motivation try to distinguish these two. Like for audit log, we want to make it more reliable. Like any log message cannot be lost, and we want to make sure all the required fields for audit purpose has to be logged. It cannot like you cannot skip a lot of message in the log information. Yeah. So if we want to do this distinguishing, of course, I think we need to strictly control, like even for the log entry, we need to have very strict access control. Who can edit this log entry, right? And this has to be mesh-wide one singleton, controlled by the audit admin. It's not like any user can modify it.
Exactly, yeah. I agree. If you're using it for security purposes, the personas are different, whereas access logs are a debugging tool, in my opinion. Is that? It looks like Lemon, you and I are also agreeing. I want to make sure Mandar and Doug, they also are on the same page. Like we should try to separate those two streams.
So I'm on the same page for separating the streams and for having different personas controlling the content of those streams.
Right. Yeah.
So then I think it falls down to how we define and where we define those streams, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just to continue that that further down, right? The separated streams. In order to actually realize it, right, or materialize it, we have right now, let's say, two different streams, right? And I'm just using example of Stackdriver because I know like we use it often, and then the standard out stream with Envoy. Even though audit logging and access logging have different uses, it looks like we just have one means of producing both, right? Even in those two different paths, there is just one. So we need to square our desire for separation of streams with the actual mechanics and what it really means to have two separate streams.
I agree, Mandar. Like if we are trying to do this separation of streams with personas, we need to make sure those personas can reliably configure what is the reliability and durability of each of those streams, and then where they go, because those will vary differently. But this is a good start. I mean, authorization feels like a good housing for the log action. I think we have to go a few steps further around where to send it, how to send it, what are the parameters on which you can actually drop things, if at all, for auditing. And then probably the log entry CRD is the one which is more contentious, I would say, around what triggers it.
Yeah. Do we actually want to have separate like a audit entry versus the normal control for the log content?
Yeah, I think that then that makes perfect sense. In which case, actually, it is not a separate console, right? So I'm actually rethinking what I said earlier. If there is a single persona or a single role that controls all of audit logging, then it makes sense for that authority to configure both when, how, and where. It's not a separation of concern then. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
So the separation of concerns is the intent of why you're collecting the log, right? It's access log for debugging, or is it audit log for security purposes?
Yeah.
Isn't there a separate concern of someone who's actually setting the authorization policy on the actual endpoints separate from audit logging? Those are definitely different concerns, right? And to me, it just feels like that because the structure is so similar, let's just reuse authorization policy when, everyone's talking about the person managing the audit logs is a different persona, which is more than likely not someone who's saying, hey, I only want these people to have access to these endpoints on my services or methods, which to me seems like the other persona that we should be talking about. And it seems like we're sort of commingling these in, auditing versus who can access it.
I think from Niraj's point, if auditing belongs to security rather, so basically it's the audit admin who is audit is you can also consider it as part of like a security admin. It's controlling what content should be audited and when to audit. Like ACL, if you try to apply access control to who can edit this configuration, you normally assign it to the audit admin, which is part of security admin.
Possibly, but the service writer themselves, right? So on my hard drive, right, I can say these are the permissions on a file. That's different than someone's auditing who's accessing the files on my machine, right? Potentially.
So I think, so Rob, so there are two things which are happening right here. So if you look at other traditional authorization products or the regular security products, whether it's the networking policies or IP tables or even firewalls, traditionals, that is the place where you configure allow, deny, and log or not. So in that sense, this location feels very, it feels natural. What you are saying is we don't have a separation of developer persona versus a security persona to begin with. So I don't think that can be fixed by this particular API. It makes it worse, but I think we have a broader problem of we don't have a developer persona separately defined because ODZ policies kind of right now they're tied to applications, but they're also tied to security, right? So we have already mingled them.
Well, I mean, not necessarily, right? Because I can go in and create policies for my application in a namespace that only expose particular services outside of my namespace, right? So I can say, here my application resides in this namespace, and the only people that can access the public endpoints, I set it through, JWT policy or something like that, right? And I can control who's coming in and what methods they can see, and I can make all the other services internal to that, which don't have access, right? And I can do that as a developer, right? I don't have to be the mesh admin or anything like that when we talk personas. And I think, it sounds like, that it would be kind of what I'm hearing is it would be great if we had something like that. And if we had something separate for configuring, auditing, and all these other things. But for simplicity, we're looking at as well, we already have this authorization policy. It has all the same fields. And all we're doing is adding an action, and we can wedge it in to this other stuff. And to me, it seems like we're looking at it from ease of implementation versus use cases, personas, and that kind of thing. And then we end up with just, going down the same path of we don't have separate personas. So
how about we just keep the Envoy filter, like if other developer wants to enter the log for debugging, they can use the Envoy filter. But this is the audit log is only configured by the security admin.
Yeah, but
Does
that's the thing, Limin, that Rob
Okay.
is saying. Right now, developers are configuring OZ policies
Okay.
because they are following namespace isolation.
On the namespace, you can still separate them. Like on the namespace, you can say which resources are allowed to edit. You can say only the security admin can edit these CRDs. Like authentication CRD, authorization CRD, they can only yeah, these are only allowed to be edited by security admin. But if you have a namespace super user permission, of course you can do anything.
Wait, I thought Rob was saying something slightly different, right? It's that we first affirmed that audit is a separate persona, and it's like a cluster-wide super user admin that decides when and what, right? When to audit and what to audit. But then Rob pointed out that we have actually delegated the CR that you will use to configure this down to the namespace. And now those two are already in conflict. Because now in every namespace, I can have whatever it is I want. Now, I just kind of brought this out. There is another way to solve that, and this comes up in other places too, right? Which is that we don't necessarily have to solve everything in Istio API, but we need to make it such that you can use admission control or other things, right, in CI/CD to make sure that you can still have the overall desired effect. So the part that I'm thinking about, right, is that you could always have admission control that says if your policy doesn't conform to like these fields, then even a namespace admin cannot write the CR, right? And then you can do that through CI/CD as well, just through composition, and then it's never an issue. It's correct by construction. So it is possible. I think we generally do need to decide though, to what extent we want to model everything in the Istio API, and what do we want to leave to other tools that are outside.
So Mandar, I think I like where you're going. So there's only one gap with this API then is, as a mesh admin, how will they configure a log policy cluster wide so that either at the namespace level they allow to override or they don't? So currently it looks like this will be always tied to a workload, right? So you can't configure things at a cluster level if I am a security admin.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Lemon?
Yeah, or the other way is we only allow user to, so that would require introduce a separate API. So basically we are saying audit is only allowed at mesh level, but mesh admin can have define some exception if they want to delegate the permission to a namespace admin.
It looks like that composition will be the most flexible one.
Yeah. Yeah. If that's the desired behavior, probably we have to have a separate like audit policy construction.
So Lumin, I think then what would help in the doc is to at the top be explicit about the persona, basically the discussion about personas that we had, and that way, yeah, and I think like that will inform the rest of the discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
This by the way is a very, very general problem, and in fact part of the extension API and just the requirements, right, of what are the goals of an extension API. And this is another extension. Now we're trying to make it first class, but this is the exact same issue. There is, to what extent do we go in modeling these use cases in the Istio API, and to what extent we say that anything that's more sophisticated than this needs to be handled outside, right? So this is a very, very this question like is pervasive.
So yeah, and I can just make one suggestion here, Lemon, which might be a reasonable middle ground here, which is for the mesh level permissions, or for the mesh level audit log capabilities, maybe we can embed some of this inside mesh config to start with, which gives you the cluster-wide defaults. And then we can keep still the authorization policy where we can add the log. And then the idea is, like Mandar was saying, you will have to have either admission controllers or CI/CD where, depending on your policy, the namespace levels are allowed or not. It can be a reasonably good starting point if you want to do, instead of creating a fresh CRD.
So you're proposing something parallel to default proxy config, but default authorization policy then? Is that?
Something like that, but you can still embed it inside the mesh config instead of creating like a new CRD.
Yeah, maybe not mesh config, but maybe a mesh level audit configuration, default configuration, default audit at mesh level. But for namespace, it can specify the namespace can override. Yeah, and for the namespace API, I think we can just use the current one.
Yeah, so the only reason I'm saying, I mean, I'm not opposed to new CRDs for the mesh one, but I know you will get a lot of pushback from the other TOC members. So try it, but your easiest path here might be, or the path might be, let's embed it within mesh config if needed, then progress it to a CRD. I can help you with that, but let's see how other TOC members react
the problem
to a new CRD.
Mesh config is currently already has too many stuff, right? And you're not able to separate the fields for different purposes.
Yeah, I agree. Mesh config right now has all the personas mixed into one, which is basically you are a cluster-wide Istio mesh admin.
Yeah, I think even at mesh level, we should have distinguishing. You are the security admin or you are the networking admin.
But so I think, again, right, this does go back again to the same question. So if changing mesh config is not a very frequent thing, which hopefully it's not, then you can actually go through the cluster admin and say, hey, make this change, right? And it shouldn't be too bad. And then the second question about modeling. Do we want to model granular access in the Istio API for each and everything that's configurable? Or do we want to go to some reasonable extent and then make sure that we integrate nicely with GitOps and other technologies where people already have set up very, very sophisticated controls and tests and approvals and things like that? So I would also hesitate before we go too far down the path of trying to model everything.
Yeah.
So Manda, what's your suggestion? You think we should rely on the external CI/CD pipeline to control?
Right. So my suggestion is that the mesh config or proxy config defaults, even though it doesn't look the best, is I think okay, because we have been doing that. And then if there is actually a pressure to say, no, actually take these defaults out of there and like put them in some other place, then we can always grow the API. But once we add the API, it's difficult to go back.
Okay. Yeah, but in this case, it's not a single field, right? It's basically we are adding a big structure to mesh config. So that part is what I'm worried about. You're basically saying the mesh admin can say, for this admin namespace doing this auditing condition, and for this dev namespace do something else, right? And it can say, for this dev namespace, delegate to the namespace owner. I don't care. So that part of logic is pretty complicated just to add into the mesh config.
So okay. So I'm actually suggesting we don't do any of that, right? So what I'm suggesting is that there is a default that is in proxy config or mesh config, and just like today, the API in the namespace, right? The API object in the namespace can just decide completely what it wants to do in the namespace. So as far as Istio is concerned, that is still the API. If, as a deployer, you want to add more controls, then you will add admission control that says, hey, namespace admin, you cannot do this, or you cannot do this under some conditions. And we don't need to actually do that in our API.
In the first version, we can delegate it to
Correct.
CI/CD or Kubernetes admission controllers, right, Manda?
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So in the first, So in the first version, we can just go with the current namespace level CRD, right? We don't need to worry about it. We leave it as the CI/CD, admin's responsibility.
Yeah. So there's one more thing which let's think about that also. We are talking about mesh config, and for the sake of this argument, we should not add it to proxy config because that will make it a boot time configuration. We want it dynamic. So mesh config, instead of adding in the mesh config, Liman, can we go down the route of the peer authentication API, where in Istio system there is a default one that we create, which is for mesh wide? Is that better than embedding it inside mesh config?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of creating a mesh level security config. We can probably, because peer authentication is just one field. Previously, we were reluctant to add it as a single API, right? So we can probably have a security configuration at mesh level, which include the peer authentication config, like MTLS for the whole mesh. This is some similar consideration, right? MTLS setting for the whole mesh, audit setting for the whole mesh. Yeah, that's one possibility. Yeah, and also things like a trust domain, I was also thinking putting into the mesh level security configuration.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe this can be left as the second step. We will have mesh level security configuration, which control all this stuff. And for now, let's start with the namespace level, even for auditing. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
Doug, Neeraj?
Yeah, I think so too.
So I'm like I was saying before, I'm fine with having the log action in authorization policy. I will have to spend some time looking at that log entry CRT. Give me some time and I will update the doc.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Neeraj.
Okay. Should we move on? We took. I know John has some stuff on the agenda. There's some other stuff too. Is it okay to transition?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for all the feedback. Yeah.
And thanks for bringing that to us. Thank you. Okay, John, did you want to talk about?
Yeah. So this is not a major concern really, but one thing I noticed is I've been testing Pilot at larger scales, like the order of 10,000 proxies connected. And one thing I noticed was that as we get up to that scale, the open census libraries are starting to take up more and more CPU. At that scale, I see usually like 12 to 15% of the CPU is spent on recording metrics. What I was wondering is, is this normal? Are there things we're doing that we shouldn't be doing and that's causing this, and what we can do to improve it, if anything? Specifically, we see certain metrics. The two main ones are There's this one for every cluster. We record how many endpoints it has, and we do that on every push. So it's kind of like n squared to n cubed almost on the number of times you record it. And then we also have one that's every push we have like a push reason, like why we did a push. And so that one also seems to take up a lot. Both of these are, multiplied by number of proxies times pushes. So these get very large as the mesh scales up.
So have these proven useful?
Yeah, so that was my next. That was kind of, so I think the EDS one, I don't think it's really useful.
Right.
Like that one would probably be the first to go. This one that's push triggers, I'm actually kind of surprised it uses so much because we have similar metrics where we record it for every push, for every proxy. Like we record the latency, convergence time, that sort of thing. So I don't know why this one actually uses more. I feel like there actually may just be a bug somewhere in that code or something that's somehow like triggering that more than we need to. That one I think is useful, so I would like to investigate that one more probably. But I mean, a proper answer could just be, yeah, let's just remove the EDS one, but I don't know, how we feel about removing metrics, that sort of thing.
Do we have a clear, like this is removed, this is without it removed benchmark that shows the performance at scale with that metric and without that metric?
Yeah, so I just tried it out on a large scale cluster with 10,000 proxies, and it does go down like 10%. It's not a huge difference. It's honestly maybe slightly less than 10%. The flame graph shows it at over 10%, but then the actual difference when you remove it is slightly less. So it is noticeable, but it's, we're not talking about 2 times performance increase or anything like that.
Can we maybe make it flag protected, like only collect this metric when you really want to, or in non-performance critical scenarios? Is that something, instead of just totally removing it, give the option of not collecting it?
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Kind of like debug logging, but debug metrics thing.
I think one more place where we can change is that so for example, I think cluster and number of endpoints, right? That has got nothing to do with pushes. Cluster and number of endpoints is actually measuring inputs to pilot. So it should not be recorded at the output.
Right. Definitely.
Right. So that we just remove the multiplied by proxies thing there. So that and then so that seems like that should definitely help, right?
Hey Mandar, so if you have sidecar resources defined, do these metrics have the labels which says which proxies are receiving which endpoints, or these are not at that resolution?
No, they don't actually, which I think is a good thing because the cardinality would be massive. Right. But it's also a bad thing because the data is not actually correct.
Right? Exactly, that's where I was going. So it doesn't feel like it would be helpful at all then.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So it is still helpful because we still know at a system level how many how large of a cluster the control plane sees. But I agree, it doesn't give you a per proxy view of that. But then you ask the proxy that question. You don't ask pilot that question.
No, Vander, but I think what will happen is if you have 2 proxies with different sidecar scopes, the first one will push and it'll say, okay, we have 5 endpoints. And then the second one will push and say we have 0, and then it will just alternate back and forth.
It's a gauge. So it is absolutely wrong, in my opinion.
Wait. No. So we're okay. So we're saying here again the clusters, the endpoints and clusters, it does not vary by, at least at the control plane, does not vary by who's asking. Well, I mean, actually, it does vary by who's asking.
So it used to not, and we probably made the metric when it didn't, but now it does.
Maybe. So, John, there are 2 things here, and the current implementation of this metric is completely broken. I looked at it long back, and when sidecar resource was being added, I wasn't sure what is going to happen. Now this explains it. That's not correct. And the second thing is we can add what Mandar is asking. I am still not sure how useful that is, Mandar, just because you can get that information very easily from Kubernetes.
Well, in a multi-cluster, multi-service registry way, right? Like Pilot definitely has a view that no other single thing has.
Yeah, that's reasonable. So basically, we can have a view of what are the inputs to the pilot.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. Like if you're, I think you guys are probably familiar with Pilot, but there's like the push context at the start of every push, which caches like everything we have, and at that point we can easily record like the number of destination rule services, virtual services,
right,
etc. I think we actually do with virtual service, although that's probably the wrong place. Like we probably want that in the actual config reading.
Correct.
But
yeah,
it is what it is.
so John,
yeah, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to say, if you have the setup still up, I would love to take a look at the setup and also the flame graph. So that's a sidebar conversation.
Let me see. I added an issue, but I don't think I posted it here. So it has a flame graph.
We can do it in a separate setting also. I don't want to monopolize this meeting.
Yeah, no, I'll just add the link to the doc and then you can take a look at it.
Right, and I just added for reference, right? What percentage? So we found that Envoy was taking 17%. However, most of that was on the scraping side. So if you look at the link that I posted of some flame graph there, you'll see that on Envoy, when you enable all metrics, it takes 17%. About 17% CPU, and that's why 10% seemed okay to me.
So I think actually on the Pilot side, the scraping is pretty cheap, unless I'm just misinterpreting the graph. But I'm pretty sure it's either doesn't even show up or it's very small that I didn't notice it. It's actually just a recording because we record this info a lot, right? Like it's one metric, so it's very cheap to scrape because it's just one I don't know what they call it, one like line and the response. It's just recording it, and there's like a bunch of mutexes and stuff like that when recording.
Is cluster a dimension though?
Oh yeah, for that one it is big because cluster is a dimension. For the other one, the push triggers, there should just be like 4 or 5.
Right. So the equivalence was also that I had measured these at ingress, where we get all the clusters in the mesh, and if you enable all telemetry, then that's where the explosion is, and again there is some equivalence, but yeah, I mean clearly Pilot and Envoy are different, and you're not seeing it in the scrape. So okay.
And also Mandar, for Envoy, if the scrapes are taking some significant portion of the CPU, isn't that on a separate master thread versus all the worker threads?
Yeah, that's even worse because now it means that you cannot push EDS or
I understand. But at least the
other things. Yes, right? Correct. The current data plane doesn't quite suffer. Yes.
So it sounds like we have some action items now out of this, right? We're going to add a new metric, get rid of the one that's not helpful, and look at maybe flag protecting ones that are problematic so they could be turned off in performance critical situations. Does that sound right?
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll take a look at that other one, the push triggers reason, because I don't know, I suspect there's some bug or something. It shouldn't be using that much, I would think.
Okay. Anything else we should talk about here, or?
One question quickly related to that. If we enable and disable metric collection, then Prometheus would be okay with it, right? I just want to make sure that. So it would think that the counter hasn't gone up for a long time, And gauges don't matter anyway because gauge, yeah, so it should be fine. If we suddenly stop collecting and then restart, the Prometheus data would still make sense.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
It would act sort of like a process restart in that sense, right?
Right, yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, there's not much time left. So there was a community member who was looking at alerting based on istiometrics. And having trouble creating docs. So I created a doc for them. So I just wanted everyone to take a look at this as we try and beef up alerting. I don't know if anyone wants to add comments now or discuss something now, but this is something I think we want to flesh out over the next weeks.
Can you pull it up? Is that like, see it? Yeah.
Yeah, this is just so I basically cut and paste this from another Google Doc. So this would be in the drive. So I'm an owner of it, but only because I copied this over, and I need to go through it as well. But I just wanted to bring this up in case anyone has expertise in alerting that they want to share or contribute to. I think there is an effort building around getting a good doc on alerting and default alerts
right. Okay.
for Istio. So please take a look. If you know of alerting configs out in the wild that are useful, this would be a good place to sort of add references so that we can develop this over the next week or two into something more substantial. So, any questions about that? No. Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is we had some discussions about the RFC for Telemetry API. So I took a quick stab at merging all the existing configuration into one sort of bigger proposal. So I just wanted to bring that to attention, everyone, to take another look at what that looks like and add comments and questions so we can keep iterating on this and hopefully get to a spot in which you can build a larger design. So I just wanted to mention that again. I don't think we need to rehash it all here, but please just take a look and see if this is sort of the format that is more acceptable than the proxy config proposal that was originally there, and seems in the right span or not. So I want to keep moving that forward as this development cycle is moving on. So just bring it up to mention that. So I appreciate any and all comments there. Is there anything else anyone wants to discuss in the last minute? Bring up?
I just had a quick question about the alerting, and maybe this is already answered, but what do we plan? So once we define the alerts, what will we do with them? Will we put them like on the website? Will we put them in the sample we ship, or what's our plans?
That's a good question. I think at a bare minimum, we would add them to the best practices documentations we have on the website saying, hey, here's some alerting configuration that we recommend. Tailor it obviously to your needs, but this is a good starting set. Just to have something we can point people at to say, this is how we think Istio should be monitored. I don't know about including it by default anywhere. That gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should include it in the doc and then provide it as a starter artifact so that people can just download it and install it or apply it
a repo.
Correct.
Put somewhere in GitHub this thing.
Right.
That will really be helpful.
Yep.
Thanks.
And by the way, we will be using it, right? So for example, the release qualification testing and monitoring effort that Shinan is working on, he is also working on alerts, and he'll probably consume this and kind of add to this. But we will be using that right away, kind of internally to so that these alerts are actually used in our own clusters for testing.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't done a sync between his PRs and this doc, so I will take the action to do that.
Okay.
Make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yep.
Okay. Well, if there's not anything else, we've taken up a large chunk of people's time. So